Perhaps the biggest topic in the news right now is tariffs and Trump's tariffs on every country, including the little tiny ones. And the question is, will tariffs actually do what Trump says they'll do? And how will they affect the average business owner and the average American? And with us today, we have an economist, Adam Ozimek. Did I get that right, Adam?
Close enough.
All right. And Adam is an economist, and I'll let Adam introduce himself, but an expert on tariffs and how they affect businesses in particular, and manufacturing, which is kind of the one of the stated goals of the Trump administration. So, Adam, it's a pleasure to have you to talk about what I think is probably the single most important fiscal topic we've got right now.
Glad to be here. I'm the Chief Economist of the Economic Innovation Group. I work on all sorts of issues from labor markets to monetary policy to economic geography. So, glad to be here to talk about this. I certainly agree with you. It's the number one economic topic right now.
So let's start with some basics here. What tariffs are and what they aren't. Okay. So one of the things that we hear all the time is, well, tariffs are just gonna cause inflation. When I look at tariffs, I think tariffs are a tax. And nobody is saying that when a state or a city increases its sales tax, that's causing inflation. They're saying, oh, that's another tax. We're going to have to pay that tax. How are tariffs really inflation, or are they a tax?
Great question. So I think that you have to look at short run versus long run. In the short run, it is like a tax. It's like a sales tax in its effect on prices. And so you would expect that to show up as positive inflation in the short run. Typically, you don't expect that to be the kind of thing that affects inflation in the long run, for the reason being that you said it is a tax, raises revenues, and so it shouldn't impact inflation in the long run. How long is the long run? That's a good question. There's a really important nuance here, though, and I think an easy way to think of it is this. So imagine if we imported all axles from abroad. Okay, every axle on every truck and every car, and you placed a 1,000% tariff on axles. Well, imports would crash to zero, right? And so, what would happen to auto production in this world? It crashed to zero, right? And so, auto production goes to zero. That would the amount of supply chain havoc that you could create there could be inflationary, especially the Fed's trying to offset it by lowering rates because, all these auto workers are unemployed. You have this massive adjustment in the economy, but we're not making any more cars. People are still buying cars. Car prices are a substantial portion of the CPI. So you can cause these sort of economic shocks and via supply chain issues. And I think a great place to look for this is like look at an oil price shock. An oil price shock shouldn't be inflationary, right? It just shouldn't be, and for the same reason that a tariff on first principles wouldn't be inflationary. But if it causes enough disruption to the economy, if it causes supply chains to pull back faster than it causes demand to pull back, you can get these sorts of medium-term inflation
Yeah.
things.
On the other hand, it sounds like it could also be deflationary, because if it causes a if there's no cars, there's no transportation, there's no work. That sounds deflationary to me, not inflationary. So the point I was just trying to make, though, is that I hear this all the time, that to me, inflation is always too much money chasing too few goods. And tariffs by definition are not that. They are, in fact, it's like you get a tax once, and so your prices go up once, but do they go up every year? Probably not. Now, granted, the disruption that they could cause, if you put like you say, 1,000% tariff, and you're talking about 10% tariff, that's a little different than 1,000%
Well,
tariff.
it's not just 10% tariffs, though, right? And so you could you what I'm trying to make the case is to be a little bit humble about the inflationary impact when you're talking about a kind of disruption that's really off the map potentially, right? If you're talking about a simple across the board, relatively low tariff, I agree. That's not the sort of thing that's going to tend to be inflationary. But when you're talking about very high industry specific, country specific tariffs, those are the kind of things where you have to say, yes, this could be deflationary, this could be
Got it.
inflationary.
Got
We
it.
don't really know because it is such a large supply chain impact that you can really end up kind of off the map in the same way that an energy price shock can do.
Got it. So one of the arguments for the tariffs, of course, that the Trump administration has made is we're trying to force manufacturing back into the U.S. because the fact is, as I understand it, we have a lot of critical components that aren't made in the U.S. I mean, whether it's, I don't know if it's axles, but for example, the magnet that goes into an electric car battery, some of the components of our defense system. I mean, there are other things that are they're just not made here. We don't have the supply chain, for example, for rare earths, which are critical to so much new technology. So, do you think, and why would it or why would it not have an impact, a positive or negative impact on bringing manufacturing back to the U.S.?
Great question. I think it's very important to sort of sort of segment these arguments for tariffs and to talk about them ranging from most to least plausible. If you're talking about a very, very narrow set of like highly defense specific inputs, say there's some computer chip, we use it in all of our missiles. Uh, China is currently dominating it. And tariffs are part of a package of goods to stimulate investment there. And I would say again, not just in our country, but this is the kind of thing that's really important to coordinate. So when you're talking about like de-risking the supply chain from the risk of like major geopolitical turmoil, it's important to work with allies on that, right? Whether it's Japan, South Korea, Canada, Mexico. So the approach I would take is to focus on what are the very specific goods that we are concerned about. What is the best way to ensure that we have a supply of them? There's a lot of different ways there. You could stockpile them. You could do a sort of thing where the government has a guaranteed purchase agreements. And they say, look, we're going to buy this many of that chip every year for the next 20 years, and we'll buy it from a domestic supplier, right? Or an allied supplier. And certainly tariffs could be part of that discussion, but it has to be targeted and it has to be a holistic plan, right? A plan, and it has to be a plan that incorporates our allies as well. Because what you don't want is this sort of race to the bottom where us and Europe and Japan and South Korea are doing increasing investment to try to stimulate production of one memory chip, one rare earth thing, and then it's just ramping up higher and higher tariffs, higher and higher subsidies. You need coordination there. Otherwise, you're going to end up with wasting money, a lot of fragility, right? In the sense that if the tariff gets pulled down one year, the industry collapses. Like you need the sort of robust supply chains, onshoring, friendshoring. And yes, in that narrow circumstance, I think you could make a case for tariffs to occasionally be a component. I don't think it's ever going to be the centerpiece of any sort of strategy like that. But that's the space that you're talking about where the strongest argument exists for it. There's a whole lot else going on other than that in our policy, of course.
Well, there is, and in fact, it's interesting to me how the Trump administration, and I kind of like this, I'll be honest, is combining their tax policy with their tariff policy on manufacturing because they're talking about bringing down the tax rate for U.S. manufacturers, increasing tariffs. Therefore, does that not encourage, and in some cases, actually almost require, if somebody wants to take advantage, if a country wants to take advantage of the U.S. market, or a company wants to take advantage of the U.S. market, which is we are still the largest market in the world, would that not encourage or demand that they build in the U.S.?
I think the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, when they cut corporate taxes, was a good move in the right direction there. Other things like high-end income taxes, that's not really going to have an impact on onshoring,
No,
right?
Trump's talking about specifically lowering the tax on U.S. manufacturers to 15%.
Yeah, I would. I think, and you're the tax expert, Tom, but I think attacking like depreciation, making really depreciating R&D investments rapidly, really depreciating capital investments, that's probably the best place to do it versus lowering, corporate tax rates further across the board. There's also, there's a industry specific tax rates. You get into you get into a lot of difficult questions. Who's a manufacturer, who's not? To me, it makes more sense to do this on a depreciation basis to focus on specific types of capital. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, so prior to 2017, we actually had the domestic production activities deduction. That was an effective lowering of the tax rate for manufacturers. That was specifically targeted to manufacturers, and it, by all accounts, seemed to work to encourage manufacturing in the US. I think there's a different argument. Should we encourage manufacturing in the US? To me, there's a lot of supply chain security. I mean, we all got disrupted during COVID because of supply chains, right? We saw how a disruption in one country had a huge impacts across the board for us, just like you're talking about all the integration. It's not just one thing, right? You disrupt one thing, it disrupts another thing, which disrupts another thing. And so I think on manufacturing specifically, one of the challenges is, and I'd kind of like to get your thoughts on this, is, stability is the most important thing for business. It's actually the most important, especially when you're talking about manufacturing, because you're trying to bring in, you're talking about building manufacturing plants. For example, where Biden, I think the best thing that happened in the Biden administration was bringing the Taiwan Semiconductor into the US and actually getting them to build plant in the US. And their biggest plant is just down the street from me. Okay. So in Phoenix, and it's ginormous. It's going to take years to build that. So you have to have some certainty that, hey, this is going to continue. And for example, one of the things that happened when in the first midterms, the 2018 midterms, excuse me, was the Democrats right off the bat said, we're going to raise the corporate tax rate, which caused instability. And then it delayed, I think, people saying, well, I want to locate my manufacturing here, which is the hardest thing to locate, right? In another country is the manufacturing. Distribution is way easier than manufacturing. And on top of that, not only does it take a lot of time and a lot of effort, but you've really got to be sure that, hey, the next administration isn't going to change this. So it's got to be a permanent thing. One of the challenges with our tax law is that we keep extending it for 5 years or 8 years or 10 years. And now we're in the same place we were in 2017. Now we got to go back just like we did with the Bush tax cuts. Now we got to keep doing this. And it seems to me like making it permanent might be a bigger deal. But I think that at a 15% tax rate, we're a tax haven. And that actually is a big deal. Then people are locating here just for the tax rate. It's not just for the tariffs or anything else. But if you add in the tariffs, it seems to me to be a coordination. What do you think about that? Do you think Trump's as scattered as people say they are? Do you think this is a coordinated effort?
Well, I'm not sure that that's where most of the emphasis is going. And part of the making a tax code be sustainable is making it fiscally sustainable, right? And making it be sort of defensible in the merits. When you're talking about massive tax cuts on tips, when you're talking about
we're not talking about that. Let's stick with one thing if we can, Adam. Seriously.
But that is one. Well, I'm
no,
talking,
no, no,
talking
no.
about the taxes.
I get that that's in the bill, but that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about specifically the idea of a lower tax rate for manufacturing, specifically that part of the bill. I don't want to talk the tips. I think not taxing tips, not taxing overtime. I think that's silly. I think that's just, I think that's silly.
I don't mean to litigate any particular part of that.
I'm talking about the very specific, you make a tax haven for manufacturers in the US. Do you not, when combined with the tariffs, encourage manufacturing in the US?
The problem is the tariffs don't have that certainty to them. So you're making the case that, look, if we do it on the tax code side, it brings more certainty to the decision. But the tariffs they're not even certain within the week, let alone whether they're going to last beyond this administration.
Let's say it played out. I mean, It is. It's a mess right now, but it's not going to be a mess in 6 months. Hopefully, it will work its way out. Okay, and once it works its way out, and it becomes like, okay, here's what it's going to end up with. Here's what we're going to end up with. Do you think that the tariffs will continue to go up and down, up and down, up and down, or do you think it's more likely that the next administration, even if it's the Democrats, will continue the tariffs just like Biden continued the Trump tariffs on China?
Well, let me answer your previous question first. That I think that focusing on taxes, tax reform as a way to stimulate manufacturing is a much smarter direction to go than focus on tariffs.
Okay.
I'm not sure that lower corporate taxes are the best bang for your buck. I think that maybe depreciation is, because it's about marginal assets. When you cut corporate taxes overall, you're cutting corporate taxes for investments made a long time ago, companies who aren't really going to be expanding. I think it makes sense to focus more on that margin through a aggressive deduction. But I agree directionally with you that we should think about how do you make the tax code for advanced manufacturing better. I don't know that we really gain much by bringing back all manufacturing. If I have to choose between the marginal manufacturer and the marginal tech company, I'm not sure that manufacturing is going to make us better off. I don't see a very strong case for it. So I would think, how do we get more advanced manufacturing? How do we get more of the manufacturing that really makes us a healthier, more stable, wealthy country? I think you can make the argument that the tax code should be a part of that discussion. So on that part, I agree with you, whether we disagree on the details of what the best way to do, but I agree that we should be thinking more about that. On the tariffs, I think that one of the things you're seeing happening is people are actually turning against tariff policy. You're seeing it in polls that moderates, independents, and Democrats are really turning hard against the tariffs, because for a long time, both parties sort of promised this kind of protectionism, and now they're getting it. And people are like, oh, I don't like this, right? It's chaotic. It's, it's really, the well is being poisoned, in a sense, the political well. So I don't think that it's really, we should think of it as a politically sustainable kind of policy. It's not the kind when you're talking about targeted tariffs, say you do something for the steel industry, right? Which we know the steel industry has a century of handouts. So that's the kind of stuff that tends to be more sustainable, right? I don't think it's good policy, but you can make the argument that it's sustainable. Broad-based, across-the-board tariffs, I don't think so, especially when you're talking about these geopolitical goals like isolating China. I think if we are trying to isolate China, we're going to need more collaboration and cooperation with our allies. And that's going to require getting rid of those kinds of across the board and industry specific tariffs that have been put in place. So I really don't think most of what we're seeing is very sustainable.
Well, so let me ask you about that with China. Is how dependent is China's economy on exporting to the US?
China runs a large trade surplus, and that surplus is certainly plays a huge role in their industrialization. They become more consumer oriented over time. So they do have a lot of consumers. When you look at their industries, most of what they make is consumed domestically, right? So like the average dollar of production is consumed in China. So we shouldn't dismiss that entirely and think that this is some tiny nation that, if you look, a counterexample would be like Taiwan and semiconductors, right? They make for the world, right? They make it for the world. Most semiconductors made in Taiwan are not used in Taiwan, but a lot of industrial goods made in China are used in China. So that is increasingly part of the story. I do think that if, we shut off exports or imports from them entirely, that's going to be a hard adjustment for them for sure. We are a substantial portion of that surplus. Now they can get around that by exporting to third countries. When you're talking about individual companies, sometimes they'll even locate production in a third country. So there's ways to dodge it. But if we tried to turn that off as hard as we could very quickly, it would be extremely, I think, big adjustment for them, as it would be for us.
Let me ask you this: would it lead to a kinetic war? Trade wars historically have led to kinetic war, have led to real wars.
Right. You can look at the example of Japan, right, and cutting off oil exports to them, and how that accelerated their.
Look at the Boston Tea Party. That was a tariff issue. Same thing led to a war.
I really think It's a very hard question. I think it's a very relevant question. And I think that people should be a little bit more concerned about it because, you know, when we back up to the very beginning, what is our motivation here? What are we trying to do? A lot of the motivation is exactly to ensure ourselves against a war with China, right? So if we're trying to avoid that outcome, that bad outcome, it doesn't really behoove us to take steps that then make the outcome more likely. And I think, it's hard to imagine the counterfactual, but I think that if we had done this disconnection from China, if we'd started doing it, 20 years ago, as many China hawks wanted and still want, if we had done this decoupling, what does China stand to lose by invading Taiwan? We lose that economic threat, right? So I agree with you. I think on balance, a hard decouple would increase the risk of a real conflict in Taiwan. Now that's outside my area of expertise, but I think your instincts are correct.
So let me ask you about another argument that has been made for tariffs, and that is that they raise revenue. In fact, there's been an argument floated by the administration that, hey, we could collect as much as $750 billion a year. We could eliminate income taxes for people under 150,000. What's your take on that argument?
Yeah, the numbers don't add up, neither do the arguments. So they try to argue that if we impose these high tariffs, it's going to cause all this industrialization. The US is going to bring back all these manufacturers. Well, okay, what's that going to do to tariff revenue if that succeeds, right? If we put tariffs on all the auto imports such that we stop importing automobiles, where does that revenue go? So you can't have it both ways. Tariffs can't be this maximum estimate, right? You have to adjust that. And you can't argue that we're going to onshore all this stuff too. To the extent that tariffs raise revenue, that reflects that it is a costly adjustment. It means that businesses and consumers are continuing to import the goods, but pay that high price for them. So I think if you want that revenue raise, it's funny because, the Trump administration is arguing that Europe's VAT is a tariff, right? And a VAT is so much more efficient than a tariff. It's like, if you think of VAT as a tariff, can we just have the VAT instead, right? Because now you're talking about a substantial revenue raiser that would be sustainable.
So now you're talking about something that I love this topic. So let's take a couple minutes because I can't resist. Because I do think that Europe's VAT, and in fact, every country has VAT except the US. Okay. Every country we trade with has a VAT, except almost every country that has a VAT except the US. Canada has a VAT. They call it a GST. China has a VAT. They all have VATs. Mexico has a big VAT. So the argument that a VAT is not the same as a tariff assumes that if we export goods to France, that they then have to turn around and export goods back to us. But that is not how the world works. Okay. The euro dollar, there are more euro dollars in the world. This is dollars created outside the US than there are dollars inside the US. That's a fact. And so it absolutely, to me, is an unfair trade practice. And I get that they charge their own people the same thing, but it's different because let's take Airbus as an example versus Boeing. Okay. Boeing sells a plane to France. There's a VAT, 22%. France sells Airbus to the US, to American Airlines. There's no VAT. Okay. So that's a 22% on gross. That is a huge number that you're talking about here. So I would agree with you actually, but I don't want a VAT unless we eliminate the 16th Amendment. Because if you add a VAT, you're just adding another tax. And that's a terrible idea to add another tax.
But keep in mind, your argument coming into this was that if we raise revenues through tariffs, then we can lower other taxes, right? So if you're assuming
that's what
that
the
we can lower
administration's saying. Yes, that's what the administration's saying.
So if they're correct, then then a VAT is the way to go about it. But if you're saying you don't believe that raising revenues will be used to cut taxes, then you should be opposed to the tariff argument as well.
And I would say, even with the tariff as an example, is that, a little bit different. Because if you're talking about people under 150,000, remember Biden had $400,000 was his target number, right? That the average person right? 100, somebody making 150,000 is certainly not in the top. I don't think they're even in the top 10%. They're in that middle group there. So you're making $150,000 a year. That's your voter. So your voter's going to want that. The voter's going to they're going to be thrilled with that. If you talk about eliminating taxes, you say, hey, we're going to use a VAT and we're going to eliminate the income tax entirely. Okay. It's going to come back, and it's going to come back as a progressive income tax, just like we have now. Okay. And it's just going to get more progressive. Yes, you're going to exempt, because a VAT also can be very regressive, right? If you're not careful, sales tax is one of the most regressive taxes we have, unless you exempt certain commodities that the poor and the middle class have to buy. But it's just an interesting argument. It's just, Trump's actually the first person I've heard talk about a VAT as an impediment to trade. I actually think it is. But let's talk about.
Oh, can we talk more about that though before we move on?
Sure.
So, all right. So the VAT doesn't affect if you're talking about Boeing or Airbus selling in France, they're selling on equal terms, right? Boeing and Airbus selling in the US, they're selling on equal terms.
Yep.
A tariff, that's not the same. The same is not true for a tariff, right? A tariff creates a difference in taxes depending on who is selling into the country. Now, if you're talking about a difference in taxes for Boeing selling into France versus Airbus selling to the US, well, they pay a whole range of different taxes. In the US, you have to pay the corporate tax. There's incidents of the payroll tax. You have property taxes.
And you have all those in France too.
Right, but I'm saying that you can't, if you're going to make this argument that it's unfair, we're unfair to manufacturers in the US because taxes are higher in France and lower here. We have to talk about the whole tax package. And now this means that in the same sense that a VAT, if that counts as a tariff, well, then the U.S. property tax, if our property taxes are higher, that counts as a tariff. So you have to look at the whole tax system. And what I would say is that the U.S. is a relatively low tax country.
I'm going to completely disagree with you on that, because if Air France does not pay property taxes in the U.S. because they sell a plane to the U.S., Boeing does pay property taxes in the U.S. Air France does not. Okay, so it's not the same. Okay, and a VAT is not the same as an income tax, because an income tax, the income tax rules don't work. VAT's effectively a sales tax. I mean, that's effectively what it is. It's a gross income tax, right? It's on the gross sales price, but we're not going to agree on this. That's okay. Not very many people agree with me on this. Actually, the Trump administration is probably the only people in the world that agree with me that I think a VAT is similar to a tariff. Let me ask you, the other question I wanted to ask you about is the trade deficits, okay? Because I find this aspect fascinating, that Trump decided to go after not just a reciprocal tariff, but actually going after the trade deficit. Just your thoughts on trade deficits. I've got an idea of where you might end up here, but tell our listeners, trade deficits, good, bad, or does it depend on the situation?
Yeah, it depends on the situation. I don't think trade deficit's a particularly important indicator. And I certainly don't think it's an indicator of whether two kinds of trade deficits, right? What's our overall trade deficit, right? Where you can make an argument that the level may be bad in the sense of it represents sort of borrowing from the future. Bilateral trade deficits, much harder to make the argument there, right? We buy from some countries, we sell to other countries. We have a trade surplus with Australia. Is that a problem for Australia? I don't think so, right? So it's not the bilateral trade deficit. Let's start there. The bilateral trade deficit is not a good policy target. It's certainly not a good policy target when you're talking about 180 countries. Now, if you're focused on maybe one or two countries who have really huge trade surpluses, and you want them to sort of like make changes in their industrial policy or rebalance their economy or whatever, there's an argument to have there. But let's take the bilateral trade deficits with the rest of the world kind of off the table. Can we at least agree that that's not a reasonable thing to focus on?
Go ahead.
Great. All right. So now you talk about our overall trade deficit. Our overall trade deficit has much more to do with domestic savings and investment. And so I think that you're going to have a very hard time getting rid of that trade deficit via tariffs, right? So you need more domestic savings.
Okay, but
It's very empirically.
how do you get more
let,
domestic savings
right.
if you're constantly shipping your money offshore?
By by shipping your money offshore, you mean people are buying our debt.
The cheap, no, we're constantly buying cheap disposable stuff, cheap stuff from China, Asia, whatever.
Sure.
Our money's it goes offshore, and the transactions are offshore. They're not back to the U.S.
Well, there are other countries who buy many cheap things from China too, and have a trade. They have a
Yeah,
trade
I
surplus, right?
understand.
Like
And it may be a
rich
problem
nations. So,
too.
so
And
buying from China doesn't necessitate a trade deficit.
so Japan, as I understand it, of course they have the largest debt to GDP in the industrialized world. Um, but my understanding is that Japan, maybe you can clarify this. Japan, most of their debt is owned by Japanese, whereas a good portion of our debt is owned by non-U.S. people. So how does that affect, or does that have any impact on our on our abilities to continue to thrive?
Uh, Foreign demand for U.S. debt certainly has an impact on capital flows and trade flows for sure. Um, but does that have any impact on our well-being? I don't think so. It's essentially that they're lowering our cost of debt. They're lending us money. We can do things with that money. What we choose to do with that money is far more consequential
Got it.
than whether someone is lending that to us. If the world stopped, for example, if the world suddenly decided the US dollar is not valuable, the US debt is risky, I don't want to invest in it, what would happen is interest rates would go up,
Right.
right? And I don't think that in the situation where interest rates go up on the US economy, I actually don't think that's going to address our savings crisis. Our responsiveness of our savings rate to those interest rates is not strong enough, right? We're still going to be running debt. It's just at a higher interest rate, right? And so that's even more deficit spending.
Right.
So I don't, even if we had a way to do that, I don't think Americans are going to like that. The higher interest rates going to slow the economy. I think it is, in general, I think it is a privilege and positive for the economy that people are willing to lend to us. The most important thing is, what do we do with that money? Are we using that money to expand our education, our capital base, keep taxes low, or are we wasting it on boondoggles? That's the much more important, or silly tax cuts that don't really do anything. That's much more important for our well-being than the lending itself. What do you think?
Oh, there's no question. There's always going to be boondoggles because politicians will always be politicians. So I don't think there's any end in sight to
We need
boondoggles.
to keep our boondoggle to GDP ratio as low as possible, I'll say.
I love it. There's a new term we need to get out there, Adam. We're going to do the boondoggle to GDP ratio. We're going
Yes.
to, I love that. I absolutely love that. So final question, where do you think, 6 months down the road, where do you think tariffs end up? Get out
My
your
gosh.
crystal ball.
I
Be
wish I
bold.
knew.
Be bold.
I wish I knew. You are starting to see more signs that the Trump administration wants to wind this down, which is different than, say, 2 weeks ago, where it seemed like they had a very high tolerance for economic pain. They were not flinching. They were not flinching in the face of interest rates going up alongside the stock market going down, which are very worrying signals. And so if you had asked me 2 weeks ago, I would have said, they're showing a high pain tolerance. They're going to keep going and they're going to push through until we get a recession. And then hopefully the recession is enough to push them off of this plan and pull back. I'm getting a sense and some signs of a little less pain tolerance lately. I'm not sure exactly what's causing that, but you had the other day, the Trump administration talking about a deal with China. It's not going to be a hard deal. It's not going to we're going to make an easy deal. We're going to bring down rates soon. It's coming. And there's a more conciliatory tone. Now, of course, today, back on the table, talking about fentanyl again, attacking China. So my goodness, it's just so hard. It's so hard to look. Normally, is in forecasting, you have to have a model of what the at least what the actors want. What the Federal Reserve wants, and so when you incorporate their expectations of their behaviors, you can model scenarios. If unemployment goes up, they'll do this. If inflation goes up, they'll do this. The administration has not really laid out what is it exactly that they wish to accomplish. They've laid out a variety of things, some of which are impossible. You're not going to bring back all the lost manufacturing jobs, some of which are narrow and defensible about national security interests, some of which are it's all over the place. It's very hard to say. If you put a gun to my head, please don't. But if you do, I would say in 6 months, I think we are back down to fairly low tariff rates. And we've made some trade deals that look like the deals that Trump made with China before, which was empty promises about soybeans that don't really address national security. The real way to change China's behaviors through, working with our allies, multilateral organizations, it's not asking that they buy more soy from us. That's not a path to prosperity or anything. But I think that seems to be the direction we're heading, but boy, it is harder than ever to say.
It'll be interesting to see. A lot of countries are sitting down and negotiating right now with the United States and trying to come up with a better deal. So we'll see if the bet works or not. I mean, to me, that's it. To me, it's either going to be a great success or a great failure. So I'm not seeing a whole lot in between. Look at the previous tariff.
Look at the previous tariffs, right? In 2018, 2019, they didn't destroy the economy.
Yeah, but they were tiny compared to what's going on now.
That may be what we end up retreating to is very tiny changes.
Interesting. So, Adam, where can we get more information about you and the work that your organization does?
You can go to eig.org to see more of the work we do with the Economic Innovation Group. You can follow me on Twitter at Modeled Behavior.
Awesome. Thank you, Adam. Very, very great having you. Really good discussion. Thank you for putting up with my pushback, and thanks for pushing back. I love that kind of discussion. That's how we learn. I think that the more real discussions we can have, the more we're going to learn. And the more we learn about the macroeconomics, the more we're going to learn about our microeconomics, and we're going to make way more money and hopefully pay way less taxes, but in the right way, not in the boondoggle to GDP way. And so if you like this, join us again, share this with your friends, share this with your colleagues, and join us next time on the Wealth Ability Show. Remember, it's always about making way more money and paying way less tax. See you next time.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.